For this video, my wife and I were celebrating our 5-year wedding anniversary. She'd always wanted to follow the traditional anniversary gift, and for one reason or another, we never did. The gift for the 5th year is something made of wood, so I decided to make her something. When I started planning it out, I knew I wanted it to be special, and since the favorite thing in the world for her are her dogs, I decided to make 3 large picture frames to display their portraits. However, with this being a surprise and having to work on it entirely when she wasn't home over 3 days, I was in a bit of a time crunch to get these done. As a small disclaimer, this was the first video I ever recorded, so a lot has changed since then in the shop, and I've learned a lot, both from a woodworking standpoint and also just video editing and that kind of thing. With that said, be sure to watch to the end and I'll go over what I would do differently now, both if I wasn't in a time crunch and the things that I've learned throughout the last 2 years. To get started, there are a few features I wanted these frames to have. First, they had to be big. I wanted them to have a bit of a wow factor versus the normal 4x6, 8x10 frames we already have all over the house. Second, it had to be a common size. I was going to buy a store-bought frame for parts, and I still only had 3 days to get a picture printed, so I had to be able to do it locally. Third, I wanted matting in the frames, and I needed to be able to get them quickly and close to home. Next, I wanted a variety of wood species for the different frames. Next, I also wanted inlays, so I was going to use the opposite species of wood for the inlay on the frames. These frames would use mitered corners, pretty common. I had initially planned on using squared frames, but when I decided to do inlays, that joint wouldn't work. Next, I wanted a smooth transition from the inlays down to the matting, so I used a 10-degree bevel to accomplish that. And the last thing I wanted to do was to add splines to the corners. Unfortunately, I didn't have a jig for that, and I ran out of time to make one, so that was one that was left off the list. I decided to make 2 walnut frames for our male dogs and 1 maple for the female. These would then have the opposite species of wood used as the inlays. When planning out what width boards to buy at the lumberyard, I made sure I would have enough scrap left over to use as the inlays for the opposite frames. I made these cuts using my miter saw and stop block, which was helpful in making a consistent cut while also saving me time. I have a slight gap in the back of my stop block, so I had to make sure the corners were facing out. Otherwise, the board would slide behind the block and the opposite side wouldn't match up. I cut these just a hair long at this point to make cleaning up the inlays later a little easier. When cutting the maple, I had to adjust my cuts due to a knot right in the middle of the board. I obviously didn't want this in the frame, so I planned the cuts around the knot and was able to actually get rid of it completely, while still keeping some of the surrounding grain in a couple of the boards for added character. After setting the blade to the proper height, I cut the groove slot in the boards to receive the inlays. Here you could also use a dado stack to help speed it up, but I chose to make several passes with a normal blade. I put plenty of glue in the slot. I didn't want any chance of it shifting even if there was the slightest gap. I used a piece of scrap wood to help seat the inlay to make sure I didn't leave any marks on the final piece. I then cleaned it up with the table saw to reduce the amount of sanding I'd have to do later on. The next step was to add the bevel. After trying a couple different angles on scrap wood, 10 degrees seemed to be the sweet spot for me. Once the glue for the inlays had fully dried, I cleaned them up back over at the miter saw with the stop blocks. To make sure I didn't miss any spots, I drew pencil lines all over the boards before sanding. I made sure to hit the frames and the inlays just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Next, we'll cut out rabbets in the board to accommodate the plexiglass, the picture, and the backing. These need to be deep enough to make sure that when we add the fasteners, we don't split the wood. At this point, it's more important to line up the inlays than the corners of the frames themselves, which can be sanded back if needed. I really like these corner clamps as they hold a very strong joint exactly where needed as the glue dries. The only downside to these clamps is that they leave a small indent on the edges. However, if I did make splines later on, you would never see that, and if not, you can just fill them and sand them and you'll never notice them. I really wish that I had time to make splines, but the staples will get the job done for now. Where I was hiding these frames, I had all three stacked together in a small space against each other, and I didn't want to risk the staples scratching the surface of the other frames. So as a quick fix, I put duct tape over the staples to keep them from scratching each other. This will never be seen and will also keep them from scratching the wall if one isn't seated properly. It's amazing when you have a joint line up perfectly, but what if you don't? Most of mine came out almost perfect, however there were a couple that were a bit off. Let me show you how I covered it up some. To make matching wood putty, I started by sanding a bunch of leftover walnut into a clean bag. If you choose to do this, I would recommend using a normal yellow glue for the maple and a dark wood glue for the walnut. Otherwise, the putty tends to take on the color of the glue and will not match the frame properly. When using the putty, make sure to only apply it to the seams of the correct wood, as those transitions are very noticeable if they're off at all. Now it's time for the final sanding. It's important you test the finish you're going to use on scrap pieces of both wood species. For instance, I love the color of the walnut when using the dark walnut Danish oil. However, the maple itself turned more of a yellow color, which I didn't care for. Because of this, I decided to use the natural color Danish oil for finishing. For the backing, I used a 1/8 inch piece of hardboard. I had to use a sacrificial fence here because the thin piece would slide under my table saw fence. After a test fit, it was time for assembly. I chose to buy frames at a local store to get the plexiglass and matting since I was hurting on time. Looking back, I would have done this differently, but I'll cover that in the end. Now we just need to get some pictures. Time for a photo shoot. Make sure to clean the glass thoroughly because rushing here will show up in your final work. So take time to make sure this is spotless. Once clean, it's time to attach the picture to the matting to hold it in place and then put the back on. To hold the back in place, I use glazing points. These are intended to hold window panes in place. They do a great job here and are also very cheap. Finally, we'll attach the hanger and we'll call these frames done. So looking back on this project, there's a couple things I would have done differently. Both of these I initially planned to do. Unfortunately, with only having 3 days to do it, I just ran out of time. First is using the store-bought plexi from that frame. On the surface, it was a good idea, it was cheaper, and it was readily available for me. However, when the sun shines through, you can see waves in the plexi, and it just doesn't look that great. Had this been a smaller frame, I don't think you would have noticed it as much, but because it's covering that large of a surface space, you can tell at times. The matting also wasn't the nicest quality, so I'm sure had I gone to a hobby store, it would have been nicer. And the second one kind of plays off the first one, but I wish I would have used splines for the joints. Had I used thicker plexi or actual glass, it would have needed this strength for the frames. Because I didn't have a spline jig, and didn't have time to make one, I had to skip this step to make sure my wife didn't come home and see the surprise early. So if I had to make this project again, I would definitely add splines for the added strength, and I like the way they look as an added bonus. That said, she still loves them, they still look great on the wall. These are just the two things I would change if I had to make the project again. That's going to do it for this project. If you're like me, when a project is done, I tend to lock in on the imperfections. My wife gets really mad at me sometimes because I'll go to show a project to somebody and I'll point out every little thing I did wrong and justify why it happened and how it happened and all those kind of things. With that, I always learn from those mistakes, which is why I leave them in the videos, and my hope is that hopefully somebody else learns from my mistake and don't make it themselves. So if you like what you saw or learned something new, be sure to like the video. If you'd like to see more content like this, make sure to check out the other videos on my channel. And be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you're notified when new videos are posted. Thank you to my Patreon supporters for helping to support the channel. Special call out to the gold members here. Thank you all so much, it really means a lot. And as always, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.